Hey everyone, this is Bo. In this video I build this coffee table for our living room. It is made from walnut and maple. The base is made from maple and is joined with mortise and tenon joints in all the corners. It then has a cross member that is dovetailed into the long aprons to keep them nice and straight. The base was then painted a dark gray color, and if you can see in the background here, probably understand why it was painted that color. The top, or I should say the bottom of the shelf, is a 3/4 inch walnut panel, and the top is also a 3/4 inch walnut panel, but it's had the offcuts glued to the underside of it to give it more of a substantial look. The overall piece measures 46 inches long, 30 inches wide, and 17 inches high. And I hope you like the build video coming up. Please comment for any questions you may have, or subscribe to the channel if you like the content you see. Thanks.
So in this video, you will see me wearing some improper footwear, and yes, I know. All right, let's get into it. We're starting by rough cutting all the base pieces to a rough length here. This is all the maple. From there, I jointed one edge and ran it through the bandsaw to get to cut this to rough width. And now here I'm doing the finish milling of one face and one edge of the base pieces. And of course, you have to check for square to make sure everything is square, because everything is based off those references. Here, I'm cutting everything to finished length, making sure I account for the integral tenons. I keep double checking my plan next to the miter saw to make sure I'm not going to screw this up. My first attempt at creating the mortises did not go well. My router bit was jumping and causing some pretty bad mortise walls here. So here's a couple examples of what happened. My solution was to use a Forstner bit and to hog out a majority of the material with like a 3/8 inch Forstner bit, because these are 1/2 inch wide mortises. So then come back with my 1/2 inch router bit and finish the mortises to make them nice and clean and not have to remove so much material with the router bit itself. Something to note here is that the mortises actually come together in the center of the leg. So the tenons will have to be mitered later on to make sure they fit. Moving on to cutting those tenons, I'm setting up my table saw right now to cut the shoulders, and you can see me tapping the saw fence over to get it perfectly lined up with my marks. So there are the two shoulders for where the cheek sides are at, and then I'll adjust my saw for the I guess the opposing shoulder pieces and get those all cut on the table saw. Moving on to cutting the cheeks of the tenon, I'm using my router table in this project to see how it works. And the first pass is pretty low with this large dado bit, and then I add a backer board to my miter gauge, raise the bit up, and remove the waste. And I sneak up on it, of course. It's always a little bit more until I get really close. After the bulk of the material is removed with the router and router table, I then move on to cleaning up these tenons. Here you can see me kind of just flattening up the shoulder. I then do some test fits, and it's a little tight on purpose, so I take the shoulder plane there and just kind of sneak up on this and make sure the fit's nice and tight. Then I mark the line on the inside once the tenon is inside the mortise and cut that with a handsaw. This is to allow the tenons to both be inside that same mortise cavity. Quick flyby of the base here. All the tenons are fitting well within their respective mortises and marked, so I put them in the same spots. It's now time to move on to the dovetailed sockets that go in the long aprons of this table. I start by laying out a fence and then using a straight bit to remove most of the waste. You can see here I bumped into my clamp, so I had to redo this, but start with a straight bit and then followed up with the actual dovetail bit. Once the socket is cut, I move on to the tail piece, which starts by removing most of the waste by karate chopping it. Actually, I use the bandsaw. And then using my router table to cut the actual tail. I had a test piece beforehand to make sure the fit was right. And there we go. This is how I spend most of my time in the shop, wandering around looking for something, in this case a hammer. And now I'm moving on to cutting the slots for the tabletop fasteners. I like to do this on the router table before I assemble everything. Pretty easy. Kind of drop the rail onto the bit, slide over, pick it up, repeat. Usually takes 2 passes, one shallow and one a little deeper. And then adding the chamfer to the bottom edge of the legs to make sure it doesn't get caught when it gets moved around the house. On to everyone's favorite activity, sanding. I sanded all the base pieces up to 180 grit, and then it was time to apply the paint. I wanted to paint these before assembly, just to make my life a little easier with a roller and just be able to hit all the surfaces really easily when they're in their respective pieces instead of all glued up and having to get into corners and whatnot. This did take 2 coats, the first coat here, and then followed with a light sand with 320 grit sandpaper, and then a second coat of paint went on. The paint is Benjamin Moore Advance, and the name of the color is Black Tar for those of you that are interested. After I got the second coat of paint on, I was just making sure there's no drips or runs or sags or anything like that on all these pieces. Happy to say, job well done. I also applied a coat of water-based poly for extra protection, and here I am pulling off the tape off all the mortise areas because I'm ready to glue it up. I glued up the long rails and legs first, and I'm using these protective blocks to help protect the finish. And then after the long ones were glued up, I came back and glued in the short stretchers. Unfortunately, there was some glue squeeze out that it was a little bit hard to get off, so I'm using a small little dental pick here. And as well, you can see that the polyurethane got marred up pretty bad, even using those blocks. So what I ended up having to do was sand the exterior surfaces of the base so I could get a consistent finish or substrate to apply another coat of water-based poly to, and here I'm rolling it on just to the external surfaces. And after applying this coat of poly, that really wraps up the base for this project. And now it's time to move on to the top and the shelf. Here's the walnut I chose. The longer pieces are for the top due to the fact I have to cut off the ends and glue it to the bottom for that thicker look. And then the shorter pieces are for the lower shelf. Some of these pieces were well too wide for my jointer due to the rabbiting ledge, so I started by rough joining one edge and then cutting it in half on the bandsaw. Later they'll get joined back together. Some of the pieces were just wide enough where I could sneak them in between the rabbiting edge and and the fence, and you can see here the guards off, and I can just sneak this one through. This first pass is not quite deep enough to get this piece completely flat, so I take it over to the bench. I use a handheld planer and just get that ledge removed, and then I come back to the joiner, join it again until it's flat, and then I hit again with the handheld planer, and then it's finally time to pass it through the planer to get everything to be uniform thickness. One thing you may be able to pick up on the video is that the end grain of the board has some writing on it. That's to make sure I keep those boards I cut in half together, and I make sure I don't rip off the wrong edge on this next step. So I am ripping the boards to width. They're not the same width, so I'm measuring, adjusting my table saw fence, ripping the uneven edge off. Once I have the sides parallel with each other, it's time to lay them out and make sure they look visually appealing. The grain match is pretty close. From here, I lay out the big carpenter's triangle. Each side of the seam gets an alternating in versus out or I versus O. So as I go back and clean up all these joints to make sure they fit nice and tight together, I'm alternating what faces against the fence to account for any of the joint or error to ensure I get a nice flat panel glue up. Speaking of glue up, it is time to glue up the top for this project. So starting with applying glue, putting a clamp in the very center of the panel, and then I add clamps along one edge to keep those edges aligned. And then I work my way from that edge where I just put the small clamps, and I work my way across the panel, getting everything lined up and applying clamping pressure as I go. Then I apply these cauls, really for peace of mind, to make sure nothing's going to be slipping or moving while it dries. After it comes out of the clamps, I like to scrape the dried glue with a scraper. And then I use a sharpened number 5 and go across the grain to knock down any of the high spots that came up by maybe a little bit of misalignment. And then sometimes I go 45, just depending on how the material's tearing out or maybe not tearing out. And then I use 60 grit sandpaper on my sander here and just get everything flat so I can start working with a flat surface. And then I cut the panel to its overall dimensions, length and width. After I cut this piece off, I always seem to have the need to try and break these pieces and make sure they always break in the wood fibers and never on the glue seam. And sure enough, they always seem to break in the wood fibers, never the glue seam. So it goes to show you that glue alone is strong enough. Moving back to the top here, after I cut off the end of material, I make a slip match to the top and glue that in place with a caul and some clamps, and then flush trim it all back to the top. I'm bouncing back and forth a lot between the shelf part and the top now, just waiting for glue to dry on one thing, so I bounce over here to the shelf, and this, I'm cutting the notches around the legs so that shelf fits inside the table. Getting into the corners with a chisel where the bandsaw I didn't want to quite go too deep because I didn't want to get into the top itself. So here was an unexpected turn of events. I went to put the shelf piece into the table base and it doesn't fit. I can't get it quite across the diagonals to get it to slip down into place. And now I'm pondering what the heck I should do. After some contemplation here, I just ended up making those notches larger in the corners, and everything fit together just fine. Now on to sanding the top. Sanding can make you a little crazy, so these are the various stages of sanding. First, coffee. Second, distraction. Third, rest. Fourth, calisthenics. Fifth, more rest. Six, dancing with no music on your earbuds at all, just dancing. Last, contemplating your life. Just kidding, it's not that bad, it just takes a long time. After power sanding up to 220, I moved on to hand sanding with 220 grit to get rid of all the little pigtails and curly cues and things like that. Once I got the top and the shelf part all sanded up, it was time for finishing. First, I'm spraying garnet shellac on the pieces. I spray the bottom, let it sit for a bit, pick it up and move it, bring in the other piece, and spray the bottom, let it sit. After it's dry enough to the touch, I will flip it over and then do the tops. I did 2 coats of shellac with 320 grit sanding in between, and then it was time to spray the polyurethane. I'm using water-based poly here, and overall this piece got 3 coats of water-based poly on the top and the bottom of each piece. And of course, in between each coat of poly, a 320 grit sanding was necessary to scuff the surface. Scuff it, vacuum up all the dust, and then I come back with a damp rag here and make sure I get up all the dust out of little cracks and crevices. Now we're finally ready for assembly. I'm lightly clamping this shelf piece in place, and I've come up with a rather creative way here to work under it so I can attach the little tabletop Z-clips to the bottom of the shelf. Once I attached the shelf, I took it inside and laid it on the top and attached that. Here is the finished piece in its final spot. As you can tell, my dogs are pretty excited about it. I think the coffee table turned out really nice. The shellac really brought out some of the character in the walnut grain, and the painted base is a nice clean look. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button or leave a comment and let me know what you'd like to see differently. This was a pretty fast moving video, so hopefully you enjoyed it. Thanks.